I'd like to welcome Mark Allan, the CEO of Landsec, to the latest of our series of Mastermind interviews, where we speak to industry leaders in order to understand their routes to the top. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Serena.
Thank you for taking part in this. So we wanted to kick off with some questions specifically focused on the listed sector. And with a portfolio value of just under 11 billion sterling, what is it in your mind about Landsec that's made the firm a market leader?
Landsec has got, I think, quite a history to it as a business. Its origins go back to the late 1940s in London, where the business founded by Lord Samuel, Harold Samuel at the time, really grew from redeveloping derelict parts of heavily bombed parts of London post the Second World War. And those areas are located in central London. London, of course, as a global city, has done incredibly well. But I think what it boils down to really in terms of the longevity of the business is the quality of the portfolio that it has and the quality of the people that have been able to, not just in that first iteration, but subsequently have been able to unlock complex development or asset management opportunities and create real value through doing that. So I think it's a combination of the quality of the portfolio and the quality of the people that have been at Landsec and are still at Landsec.
And Landsec has obviously had to rejig its portfolio over the years. And can you just give us a little more insight, therefore, as to what the key strategic focus is for the business currently?
Yeah, I think sitting behind everything that we do is really a focus on creating and curating great urban places. And there are really three types of place, if you like, that we focus on. So those would be either office focused, so particularly in central London, the majority of our central London assets are focused around large multi-let offices. We then have a focus on prime destination retail, and that's a combination of city centre located shopping centres, but also big catchment dominant out of town shopping centres. And then our third area, which is probably the one that's growing the most and is the most recent addition, is a real focus on mixed use places. And I think that's been a really significant change in how people are thinking about the built environment, and therefore an opportunity for us to adapt our approach and apply our skills in a different way. So mixed use would often be residential led, I think, more often than not these days, but as the name would suggest, would have a whole range of different uses within there. But what sits behind all of that is focusing on creating, curating and sustaining great urban places.
And what do you see as some of the key benefits that you've gained from working on a PLC board? So
I think you're part of a team that's having to think long term. There's inevitably, and certainly for the larger businesses, there's more profile, there's more scrutiny to what you're doing. I think that does lead to more discipline in decision making, more focus on really understanding how do we create value, why are we here, what are we adding, not just for shareholders but more generally. So I think it does force you to think about things in a more rigorous and disciplined way, perhaps. I think, of course, there are flip sides to that, because it can push you towards being overly risk averse and being concerned about making mistakes that are perhaps higher profile and more visible or are going to be put to more scrutiny. But fundamentally, being a listed business, having more investors that are effectively critiquing and testing your strategy and your performance in executing that strategy should ultimately lead to a better, more refined and more robust strategy for a business going forward than you would perhaps get in the private market.
That's a solid answer.
And Mark, just looking at the way that your career has evolved, you come from a financial management background, having previously been a CFO. What bearing has that had on your role as CEO as you reflect on that evolution of your career?
So I was CFO at Unite between late 2003 and early 2006. So all of 2.5 years. And bluntly, to be honest with you, I'm not sure I was particularly good as a CFO. because the role of a CFO in the business, and particularly as a counterweight, if you like, to CEO that may be more ambitious for wanting to grow the business, take a bit more risk. You do need a CFO that works very effectively in tandem with a CEO. Where I think it's really helpful in a CEO role is that, whether it's in the real estate world or anywhere else, the financial component of a business and understanding how to drive financial performance. In real estate, understanding how to put together financing and make sure that the balance sheet is robust and you've got a good and scalable and resilient funding plan. Those are all things that I think you really do need to understand as a CEO, certainly in a real estate business. I think there are some watch outs, because I do think a lot of people with a finance background, because it covers so much and is so broad in terms of touching every part of the business, I think you can be at risk of undervaluing some of the things that aren't in that finance sphere, and some of the more creative ways of adding value, for example, or some of the more entrepreneurial or instinctive ways of doing things that don't perhaps lend themselves so naturally to a more logical finance type approach. I think can cause, can sometimes be a little bit undervalued.
And just thinking about the way that you've made that transition from CFO, admittedly in a fairly short period of time that you were in it, through to the general management piece, what was the critical piece of advice that you were given at that stage to successfully make that transition?
Well, it was nearly 20 years ago, so it is a while back. But and I don't know that I was necessarily remember any particular pieces of advice at the time. I think the piece of advice perhaps that I wish I had been given at the time is to really focus on letting go of the finance brief. Is if you are a CFO and you step into the CEO, I think that's quite a tough gig for the new CFO to follow.
Yeah.
And you almost need to force yourself to let go of the things and force yourself to spend more time in areas that you wouldn't have been spending so much time in from a finance point of view. And starting to turn some of those things that you don't know into things that you don't know, and eventually know that you do know. You see, I have a tendency for overly complex phrases like that. Sorry.
What do you think is the sort of the key component parts of strong leadership in today's market?
I guess the way I would talk about today's market, and perhaps in comparison to where it may have been previously, is that it does feel to me that, and perhaps everyone says this, who knows, but so it may just be a case of hindsight. But I think that there are far more things changing and far greater levels of ambiguity and uncertainty that leaders have to grapple with. And so first and foremost, I think you have to be comfortable dealing with that ambiguity and being prepared to take decisions about the direction of your business and the pace of your business based on the best information you've got, but recognizing there's stuff that you'd love to know that you just don't know. And that's probably the single most important skill I think you need at the moment. I think other things about making sure you've got the right people around you with skills that are complementary to yours, being very self-aware, understanding what your skill sets and strengths and blind spots are, and looking to complement that with the team you have around you. I think those things are as relevant today as I think they've always been, but it's probably the ambiguity and just the level of and pace of change in today's world that is the biggest thing to grapple with.
And just on that piece about the pace of change, I mean, with not too much of a crystal ball, but what do you anticipate as being the key challenges facing the next generation of leader and how they need to be able to adapt to it?
So for real estate specifically, I think what we as a society want and need from our built environment, I think is going to is changing and will change quite dramatically over the next 10, 20, 30 years. And that's just in terms of how space is being used, the interface and interaction between the digital or virtual world and the physical world, and there's so many things, retail being the most obvious recent example, that mean that what people now are using the physical world for is complementary to something that they can do online. Whereas a lot of people still working in the real estate world today, I think would be much more used to a world where everything was largely happening in a physical built environment. And it wasn't that long ago that I was sat at a dinner where someone with a very digital background leads a very large, successful digital business, described what we had as a business at Landsec as the physical metaverse. So I think things are sort of going sort of full circle almost. I think that interface of physical and digital is going to be a big thing to deal with. And I think in a more sort of broader social aspect, I think the whole agenda around social responsibility, the role of the media, our political leaders, and all those things coming much more closely together. I think the way in which businesses are judged and the way in which they build reputations, or indeed in the way the reputations are damaged or destroyed, I think that's a far more fluid and multifaceted world to grapple with. So how you manage reputation and recognise that perception and reality are not necessarily the same things, I think that's going to be a far greater challenge for the next generation of leaders than it has been for those that have gone before.
And with those component parts over which you have less influence and control, what are the key issues that keep you awake professionally, looking after and at the helm of Land Securities or Landsec?
I think it's really, I guess what I always wonder is, what am I missing? Is there something we haven't seen? Is there something that we're not taking into account? And so you've always, I think, got to be almost sort of second guessing yourself and just going back over and revisiting decisions and making sure, what have I missed? And being prepared, if you come across something, see something different, be prepared to change direction quickly if you need to. And anyone who was running a real estate business in the UK in August, September, October of 2022 will know exactly what I mean by that, because it was just an insane environment that we were operating in, and there were a lot of decisions that had to be revisited and checked very, very quickly. But I think even besides that, there can be long-term trends that creep up on you, and you just got to always be prepared to step back and say, what might I be missing? What could I go wrong? And back to one of the I think Serena's questions earlier about the role of a board. I think having non-execs on a board that have a perspective that's outside of your business and in many cases outside of your sector, I think is really helpful in just second guessing some of those things and just asking things from a completely different perspective that makes you think, actually, yeah, you're right, I hadn't necessarily thought about that in that way.
And as you reflect, putting the interest rate spike aside, as you reflect on your career, is there anything that you might have done differently, and if so, why?
I'll be honest, I honestly don't think there's things that I would say I would do differently. I remember at different times, I certainly remember getting towards a 10-year anniversary as CEO at Unite, and having started that role as CEO at Unite at the age of 33. So, and thinking I could stay here and just be a one sector person for the rest of my career, or I can go and try and do something different. And I think when you start realizing that some of the things you're doing in the business, you question, am I doing this because these are a good idea for the business, or am I doing it because I'm bored? I think being prepared to know when to move on to the next thing and not hold on to what you've got is something that I will try and keep. So I'm sure that the nearer I get to the end of my career, the more difficult it'll be to do, I'm sure. But the idea of not holding on to what you've got and being prepared to leap to the next thing is something I would always try and challenge myself to do.
Brilliant.
Getting to know you, Mark, as the individual, I think it'd be great for the listeners, viewers, to understand a bit more about you as a person. How do you manage to find a work-life balance, given that you've got the city constantly aware of what you're doing?
I don't think I've ever really looked at things as being sort of in completely different compartments. And I think you do need to be able to manage yourself and your resilience to recognise that sometimes I'm going to need to be really dialing up the amount of stuff I'm doing because there's a load of stuff happening work-wise, and other times you need to take the opportunity of things being a little bit quieter to recognise there's a bit more time for me to do other things here. So I think there's definitely an element of, I suppose, regulating yourself to make sure that you're not overly focused in one place, too much in one place or another, but also recognising at some times you are going to need to be 90% in the sort of the workplace, just because you've got stuff going on that necessitates it, but you can't run at that the whole time. So I sort of, and this is not precise by any stretch, but I always think that I should be operating at 60 to 70% of what I think I could operate at, because there will always be things that will come up that you need the capacity to be able to do without dropping a load of other stuff. So that's a very sort of subjective way of describing it, but I think always feeling that you always need to have some capacity because you might need to dial things up.
You've got some gas in the tank.
Good way of managing the impact on yourself for the long term.
And in terms of the single thing that you're most proud of in your career, and also combining that with what are the defining points in your career which have helped you get to where you are today, what would you point to? I think
I always go back to leading Unite students through the financial crisis, because that was still a relatively young business at that time. I was 2 years in as a CEO, had never seen a recession in a leadership role, let alone a global financial crisis. And you realise pretty quickly that there's no one else who's going to make the decisions. So you need to kind of get on with it and back your judgment. And we, because it was a team of us that were doing it, I think learned a huge amount. And certainly when we saw the all of the fallout from very rapidly rising rates and all of the trustonomics and all the stuff from last year, and how quickly and rapidly the market was changing, whilst the parallels weren't perfect to the financial crisis, it felt a little bit like we had a playbook. Whereas if I go back to COVID, and in COVID I was leading one business and joining another, so there were other challenges to
Uncharted.
it. COVID, there wasn't a playbook, and so you learned a lot from understanding the resilience of your business and the resilience of your team in COVID. But really, the formative thing for me was the financial crisis, and getting through that unscathed, and not just that, actually using that as a springboard to accelerate the growth of Unite as a business.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. That's great.